Chapter 271 Blade Tempest by Hydesgrain. The youth in front of him didn't look special in any way, but the purple-pinkish transmuted mana he saw within the youth seemed weird, as Jason never saw such transmuted mana. His mana eyes could only work perfectly fine if he knew all affinities and the color of its transmutation. However, right now, the only thing Jason knew for sure was that the youth in front of him was at the first expert rank, while his mana core size was at the third expert rank, which indicated that he contracted a soul bond which was either at the peak evolved rank if the youth in front of him possessed a soul world with a slightly higher amplification than the average had, or that his soul bond was a low unblemished beast. Either way, it wouldn't make a huge difference, because it was not essential for Jason to know, who was still trying to think what exactly his opponent's affinity was. In the end, he never saw this affinity and would have to fight against his opponent without knowing what to be careful about, which was not something he had to do for quite a while. Met with the unexpected situation, Jason was overly cautious, as the eye initiated the start of their fight. Unsheathing his dagger, he prepared himself to be attacked only to see that his opponent didn't move at all, only to take out a wand. Ugh, they're going all in now, huh? Jason thought, disgruntlingly as he waited for several more seconds in which nothing happened before he manifested a few icicles towards the lean youth. The youth in front of him still didn't move from his position, yet he lifted his arm with the wand in it as his eyes suddenly glowed in a purple-pinkish hue. Without further ado, the icicles that previously shot towards the youth changed their trajectory, which caused Jason's eyes to widen for a second as he slowly began to understand his opponent's affinity. Is it psychokinesis? He asked himself, baffled about what he saw as he noticed that the lean youth's affinity enveloped his icicles only to move them away without making it too obvious. Thinking about the possibility of his opponent having a psychokinesis affinity, Jason's eyes brightened up because this was something he also wanted to obtain in the future. As such, he wanted to test out his opponent's limits as he summoned 24 icicles which he shot towards his opponent, who simply swung his wand when his eyes glowed up in a purple-pinkish hue once again, changing the trajectory of his icicles. Does he use the wand as a means to distract me? Jason concluded, because the wand itself didn't seem important for the youth in order to change the icicle's trajectory, and it was most likely only used to reduce his mana consumption. Looking at how easily his opponent changed his icicle's trajectory, Jason wanted to increase the difficulty by another notch as he manifested 24 icicles and additional 24 fireballs, which he threw towards the lean youth, who smiled lightly. If he can easily change the fireball's trajectory, who can also burn through mana to a certain extent, his psychokinesis is really powerful, he thought, with a single sweat pearl pouring down his temple, as he witnessed the lean youth's smile stiffening for a moment when he figured out how threatening the fireballs really were. Nevertheless, he was still able to change their trajectory, even if it was slightly more difficult, which was noticed by Jason. With this conclusion, it was obvious what Jason should do now, as he already prepared to manifest several dozen fireballs in his mind simply because his mana consumption was much lower than his opponent's, while he could easily replenish them without the need to even think about the passive mana gathering technique, thanks to his sub-area within his mind. Smiling brightly, Jason decided to ignore this option for now because of a relatively simple reason. He was curious about the psychokinesis affinity and how his opponent would change the tide and attack him. As such, Jason continued to manifest icicles in order to attack the lean youth without being too obvious about the advantage he figured out. Their fight continued and another minute elapsed until Jason could finally hear an enraged shout after enduring an onslaught of almost 100 icicles, when the lean youth took a dozen swords out of his storage device, before exerting his affinity to levitate them in the air. In the beginning, the lean youth only wanted to test the waters, but he could have never imagined that his opponent would be so frustrating, which was unexpected. However, instead of retorting the onslaught of icicles, he wanted to endure it by minimizing his mana consumption until the golden-eyed youth's mana was drastically reduced, yet even after a minute, this didn't seem to happen, which was extremely annoying and frustrating from the lean youth's perspective. As such, he changed from his defensive standpoint and started a counteroffensive with a dozen grade 1 swords he could barely control by using his whole focus, mana sensitivity, and control. His whole body was groaning because the mana consumption was devastating, and if he were to estimate how long he was able to attack with such a high mana consumption, 30 seconds was probably the most he might take out by draining his mana core completely. Nevertheless, 30 seconds were more than enough, as he ordered the swords to shoot at Jason, who was smiling brightly at the sight of 12 swords attacking him at the same time. His affinities proficiency, mana control, and sensitivity must be extraordinary, Jason thought as he observed his opponent's mana fluctuations intently, and controlling swords seemed to be more difficult than his low mana consumption fireballs and icicles before he averted his attention towards the sword that was about to pierce into his flesh. Exerting the weightless steps technique to his current limitations, he additionally circulated mana through his body before twisting his body in order to deflect the advancing swords, as he additionally manifested an ice wall on his right and left to forcefully halt another batch of swords. There were still 2 swords that shot towards him from above, which he couldn't deflect with his ice affinity or daggers, as he barely manifested a spear of fire above him which he shot towards the 2 swords. Clashing upon each other, one sword immediately turned into scrap, while the other continued its approach, piercing into Jason's shoulder, which sustained a deep cut, and he could only prevent the worst by a hair length. Gritting his thought because of the pain, Jason thought that his control over 2 affinities at the same time, exerting a martial art technique and circulating mana in his body at the same time, was still not good enough. As such, he decided to stop with the fancy attacks and decided to change back to his rather rough and crude fighting style, which suited him much more, as he injected mana into his Viridi Starstream daggers, only to slash at the swords broadside to shatter them with brute force. The swords his opponent purchased couldn't even be considered well forged because all of them had tiny flaws within them, while their mana conductivity was at most average. With perfect purified grade 1 weapons, his attacks would not only be much faster and stronger, but I wouldn't be able to destroy them so easily. Sighing, Jason found many weaknesses inside his opponent's attacks as he slashed towards the sword's flaws to shatter them, only for the lean youth to hurriedly retract them. Gulping down his saliva, the lean youth was astonished that Jason was able to cope up with his swords that easily, but he had still more than 15 seconds left to use a dozen swords to attack at the same time. With this in mind, the lean youth threw out a batch of razor-sharp blades from his storage device, which he controls with his affinity. A dozen blades that were sharpened on all sides levitated in front of him, as he obstructed them to spin, only to shoot them towards Jason. That's definitely dangerous, he only thought, and it was obvious what would happen if he were to be unable to evade or deflect the spinning blade tempest in front of him. Taking a deep breath, he exerted the weightless steps technique before charging towards the spinning blades that shot towards him. Manifesting a dozen icicles after another, he shot them towards the blades, which were slowed down, as Jason used his Viridi Starstream daggers to slash at the 2 rotating blades in front of him to forcefully avert their trajectory, which broke one apart while receiving a light cut from the shattered parts. Not halting in his tracks for a single second, Jason ignored the remaining spinning blades as he appeared in front of the lean youth, who made a huge mistake because he didn't calculate his forceful advancement into his plans. Slashing out with his sharpened daggers, Jason killed his opponent as the eye announced his victory. Chapter 272 Forceful Advancement by Hydesgrain. Understanding how his opponent's psychokinesis affinity worked with the help of his mana eyes and several small experiments, Jason was sure that the affinity was definitely powerful, yet tricky to control. As such, he could just charge ahead forcefully, changing 2 spinning blades' trajectory without many difficulties, defeating his opponent. Walking out of the arena, he approached the flays and sat down next to them before he tended his wound at the shoulder, while Gabriella used her healing ability to help him. Circulating his mana in addition to Gabriella's healing and recuperation potions, Jason's wound already started to heal after a few seconds, which was certainly good. Fortunately enough, the wound on his shoulder was nothing major and would only need some time to heal, without creating a hindrance for his fights on the next day. Replenishing his mana, Jason only heard Greg next to him mumbling. You only lead your opponent around and still sustain an injury. Upon hearing this, he couldn't help but smile because Greg's words were certainly true, and if he simply threw several dozen fireballs towards his opponent, the fight would have been over in a matter of seconds. If the psychokinesis affinity his opponent used was not good enough to change the fireball's trajectory without consuming too much mana, which was most likely the case. Controlling objects from far away was highly likely to require much mana, and in the end, everyone with a high mana core rank was able to move around objects to a certain extent. As such, the psychokinesis affinity had to be something more unique, otherwise, it would be entirely useless to contract a soul bond with such an affinity. While Jason continued to think about his opponent, it was already Greg's turn. His opponent had a mana core size of a 3rd expert rank, while he had an earth affinity that was most likely at the peak evolved rank. Initially, Jason wondered why he seemed to be one of the only first-year students with multiple affinities, but after thinking about it for some time, it seemed logical. Just because his soul world was unimaginably large, it didn't mean that other soul worlds were equally large. It was already above average and considered rare to be able to contract 5 soul bonds, and with this fact, other students would be reluctant to contract a soul bond below the magical rank. For some influential students, even a common magical ranked beast would be considered foolish to contract because everyone wanted to reap the most benefits with their soul bond. In the end, most soul bond contracts would be formed with rare and unique beasts which had either mutated affinities or strong abilities one could inherit. This only included prodigies or wealthy families because such beasts were not only rare to find, but it was even more difficult to capture their offspring or if necessary the matured beasts. Thinking about this, Jason could only praise his own soul world because it was superior to every soul world he ever heard about, which caused him to wonder once again if his soul world was only so special because he was presumed to be a half Celestia. But there was no reason for him to think more about this because there was no answer for now. It was better to watch Greg's fight, which started with his opponent shooting several earth spikes at Greg, who only punched at him, wearing his gloves. Being forced to retreat multiple steps because of the impact, it was obvious that the elemental affinity was stronger than Greg's physique, which was nothing surprising. Noticing that Greg didn't utilize an affinity, the earth affinity user smirked as he manifested a dozen earth spikes which he shoots at him in succession, only to force Greg to retreat further. Gritting his teeth, Greg pondered what he should do, and without an affinity or higher velocity, he wouldn't be able to evade the earth spikes that were as fast as Jason's icicles. He couldn't evade too. As such, Greg used his trump from the beginning, and his skin turned red when his body enlarged, with his eyes turning red without losing their clarity. Receiving a high amplification in his physical strength, Greg was able to evade the earth spikes without much difficulty. However, rather than doing so, he just punched at the incoming spikes, as if they were nothing, shattering them into smitherness. Exerting his movement technique, he pushed himself from the ground, creating tiny cracks below him as his speed accelerated. Appearing in front of his opponent, who was shocked about the sudden change in Greg's demeanor and appearance, he used his whole remaining mana in order to manifest a thick earth wall in front of him as he retreated several steps. With the thick wall in front of him, the youth took a deep breath when he suddenly heard thumb noises. Boom, boom, boom. The whole arena resounded in several loud explosion-like noises, and Jason couldn't help but smile weirdly as he perceived that Greg forced himself through the thick earth wall that was rather crudely manifested without compressing it in order to create a stronger defense. Everyone looked at the match in awe, as a 2-meter-tall Greg broke through the whole several-meter-thick earth wall as if it was nothing. Swiping away the dirt of his face in order to see clearly, Jason saw Greg smiling, as he continued his charge to his opponent, who gulped down his saliva, as his eyes quivered in fear. Punching his opponent with all his might, Greg hurled him out of the arena that was more than a dozen meters away, where the Earth Affinity user remained lying on the ground, without even trying to stand up. Hearing him gasping for air with difficulties, everyone sighed in relief as it meant that he was still alive. The AI announced the winner, and Greg's body shrank as he stepped out of the combat arena, where he looked at Jason, who sat on his seat, giving him a thumbs up. Returning him a peace sign, the two youths smiled foolishly, as both the Flays and Jason stood up to walk towards Greg. Talking with each other, they didn't even bother to continue monitoring the tournament, because their time together was running out. Instead of watching the tournament, everyone wanted to spend more time with Jason as they would separate soon. Arriving at home, they ate something, played games, and talked about all kinds of things. Jason also tried to hint at the Flays multiple things about foreign races, and how overbearing some big families might be if Greg or Malia were to become too strong. However, he felt as if they didn't even hear him at all, or maybe they didn't want to, while Greg only looked at him, pondering about his words as if they were an alien language. When Jason saw this, he wondered if he spoke in the universal language the foreign races used, but nobody looked at him like Greg did, which told him that his friend was just confused. In the end, he was reluctant to tell them everything because even his masters, who were aware of most facts, were shocked about the truth, which told Jason that it would be even more horrifying for normal citizen, who was not even able to enter the lick stage by compressing their mana into liquefied mana drops. Sighing deeply, he only shook his head as he spent the whole day with the Flays, as they didn't have to go back to the arena because Malia lost the day before, which was not even that bad, considering their current circumstances. It was already evening, when his quantum bracelet vibrated violently, which caused everyone to look at his wrist, as a holographic screen appeared in front of him. Surprisingly, it was Seren who called him and answered the call. He only heard him hesitantly asking, "Jason." "Here is Seren, are you at home right now?" Chapter 273 Impatience by Hydesgrain. Hearing Seren asking if he was at home, Jason immediately answered, "Yes, I'm with the Flays right now. Did something happen?" He was sure that nothing shocking happened because Seren sounded neither enraged, flustered, or anxious, but only hesitant, which was why he still asked to be sure. After hearing that Jason was at home, Seren sighed in relief as he asked with a firm voice, "Nothing bad happened, it's rather the contrary. The only problem is that I'm somehow in a hurry. Do you have time right now, or may I come to you to discuss something?" Asking this, Jason averted his attention to the Flays, who heard everything as Mark nodded his head saying, "There is no problem if he comes and it sounds important, so don't bother about us." Seren heard Mark saying this and quickly thanked him as he hung up the call before the doorbell rang only a moment later. Noticing this, everyone was astonished, only for Gabriella to chuckle lightly as she said, "What a cute boy, ha ha." Even Mark smiled lightly, while Jason walked towards the door, which he opened where Seren stood looking at him as if he was about to pounce on him. "Come in," he quickly said before his friend would pounce on him as he stepped aside. Taking off his shoes, Seren walked inside the house, where he found the Flays eating dinner, and he quickly apologized for interrupting the dinner time. Seeing his polite behavior, Gabriella couldn't help but smile as she reassured him that it was fine and that he could talk with Jason about the important matters. Hearing this, he quickly grabbed Jason and asked him where his room was. Being dragged to his own room, he tried to figure out the reason for Seren's behavior, and he was relatively sure that it had something to do with his second soul bond, an Earth Dragon. Inside his room, Seren just sat down on the chair that stood close to the bed, where Jason sat down, waiting for his friend to start with his important matter. However, seeing that Seren turned from his impatience to uncertainty, Jason was forced to start. "What exactly do you want to talk about, Seren? It has probably something to do with the Earth Dragon that laid an egg, right?" Hearing this, Seren only nodded his head, before he took a deep breath, as he said, "The situation with the Earth Dragons is more difficult than we imagined. You probably don't know about this, but they live below Cryo City nearby the Mana Vein, where they have enough mana to survive, procreate, and even become stronger until they reach their racial limit." Jason's eyes widened when he heard Seren's words, "So these Earth Dragons are right below us," he thought, gulping down his saliva when Seren continued. It was roughly a century ago when the first few sovereigns saved the last earth dragons on Canir before they were almost annihilated by ancient behemoths and other strong races that desired the earth dragon's blood, which is apparently beneficial for these beasts or something like this. Obviously, many big clans also wanted to either subdue the earth dragons and force them into a soulbond contract or even kill them to receive valuable ingredients from their carcass. However, instead of using either of these solutions, the earth dragons tried to make a deal with a few big clans, demanding to stay alive, without being forced into a soulbond contract, while at the same time receiving a certain degree of safety from other beasts that might hunt them. The few big clans accepted this deal, but only under the condition that their offspring were allowed to be contracted as soulbonds. Obviously, the earth dragons didn't accept this and would rather die than forcing their own children to submit to a soulbond contract only for them to stay alive. As such, both sides were somehow forced to find terms everyone found profitable, otherwise, the big clans would just kill the earth dragons, without bothering about their conditions, which they were aware of. In the end, the earth dragons agreed that their offspring could be contracted, as long as they were willing to. Before hatching, the unborn earth dragons are already able to faintly communicate with their parents when they're still inside the egg, and if they're not completely against the thought of forming a soulbond contract, descendants of the big families who made the deal with the earth dragons were allowed to approach their nest. This soulbond contract allowed earth dragons to adventure throughout the Canir, next to their new master, and even if they were in a similar situation to being enslaved, they were still more secure and free compared to being forced to live underground in order to stay alive due to the apparent threat from all kinds of lord or even higher-ranked beasts that desire their faint dragon bloodline. Nodding his head, Jason was deep in thought as Seren spoke, and he found it weird that the earth dragons just remained underground without even bothering to come up, even if it might be dangerous. Are they also scared of us humans? However, thinking about this, Jason felt somewhat disappointed because he always imagined dragons to be beasts with a lot of pride that didn't allow anyone to suppress them and that they would fight against anyone damaging their pride. Maybe it was only the earth dragons that allowed themselves to be subdued like this, almost as if humans were breeding them underground, as a sudden thought emerged within him. If the ice dragon, the Drake family patriarch forcefully contracted, acted so repulsive, why are the earth dragons so different? Not only is their racial limit a difference of 2 whole ranks, but the demeanor is also like black and white, completely different. Could the purity of their bloodline or something like that be the reason? Other than that, I can't imagine a reason for dragons to be so prideless. Jason heard a lot about dragons, whether they were Eastern or Western dragons like Shane and Dahlia called them, but all of them had a few particular things in common. They were extremely strong compared to their mana core rank, while their affinity was also superior, allowing them to fight even beasts with a stronger mana core rank. However, from the demeanor, dragons were labeled as greedy and prideful, which was the reason for Jason to think that the purity of the earth dragon's bloodline might be low or thinned out. Seren was still not done talking, and Jason could only sigh as his friend didn't seem to end his speech. Over the last 2 years, the remaining earth dragons laid 5 earth dragon eggs, which is more than they laid over the last several decades together. Isn't that amazing? Nevertheless, more surprising is that 3 of them want to form a contract with humans. Right now the Jiwaya family is the first one that is allowed to pick a new soulbond because there is not a single descendant from the Drake family who is able to form a soulbond contract with an earth affinity beast. As such, I can choose my second soulbond out of 3 earth dragon eggs. Over the last few days, I already went towards the earth dragons and took a look, but even Till is unable to tell me which one of them is the best choice to pick, while he could only tell me that one of the eggs seems to have slightly lower mana fluctuations, and both of us immediately thought about you. I don't want to make the wrong decision and wanted to request your help to tell me which earth dragon egg is the best for me to figure out if I should follow my gut feeling, or continue to ponder like I'm currently doing. Listening carefully, Jason was glad that his friend finally finished his speech, as he sighed deeply. There was no reason for him to decline his friend's request, and Jason nodded his head, as he said, I can definitely help you out, but how long does it take? I have my tournament matches tomorrow early in the morning and have to be back by then. The tournament itself was not really important, but he also wanted to have his last fight against Greg, which was what really mattered to Jason and also the reason for him to ask Seren this. If we take the shaft, one trip to the Mana vein will probably take 3 hours and then, we still have to walk for 2 hours through the tunnels. Mumbling this, Seren averted his attention back to Jason as he reluctantly said with disappointment in his voice. If you really want to attend the tournament tomorrow, by all means, we can only postpone the trip to the Earth Dragons to tomorrow after your tournament rounds in the morning. It was obvious that Seren was disappointed, but he wouldn't just neglect his own wishes to please others as his friendship with Greg was more important to him than Seren's. Chapter 274 Won by Hydesgrain. Not only was Jason sure that tomorrow would be his last fight against Greg, but his gut feeling told him that the next day would be extremely important for his future. One wrong step might lead to him having a devastating future, while several other steps could lead to a bright future. It was an extremely weird feeling inside him, but there was not really anything he could do to prevent the next day, without suppressing his own desires. Shane told him to go all out if he wanted to and he might as well do so once it was necessary. Seren looked at Jason somewhat disappointed and he wanted to ask him if he really had to attend the tournament the next day or why it was even so important. However, after staring into his friend's determined eyes, Seren knew that asking him was completely useless. Sighing deeply, he just said with a hanging shoulder and a sad expression covering his previous impatient and overjoyed mood. Let's meet tomorrow once your 2 fights are over, okay? Jason only nodded his head and he noticed Seren's frustration which he could also understand, as he smiled lightly. As such, he led Seren, who didn't want to bother him anymore, out of the house after they finished the short discussion. Sighing once again, Seren looked at him with a pitiful gaze, as he turned around only to say, "See you tomorrow." Stepping out of the house, the Flays noticed Seren's sour mood, which was entirely different from his previous demeanor and made them curious what exactly happened between Jason and his friend. However, they didn't want to infiltrate their private business and only gazed intently at Jason who was uncomfortable, as he just explained. Seren wanted my help with something, but I had to postpone his request because of the tournament tomorrow. Maybe I would have accepted it if Greg and I wouldn't be fighting against each other tomorrow, but it's probably the last time we're able to fight against each other for a long time, so I don't want to miss out on that. Malia and Greg's mood immediately plummeted with Jason's last sentence, even if they were already aware of the fact Jason said. Everyone felt that tomorrow or at most the day after their ways would separate and they could understand why Jason decided against helping his friend right now, even if he might be displeased about Jason's decision. I'll still help him, but only after I fight Greg and it might take some time until I'm back. Probably either at night or the next day in the morning, probably. Hearing this, Malia's lips twitched as she hesitantly asked, so it could also be that you're completely gone after you and Greg fought against each other because your master tells you to depart once you helped Seren. Pondering for a moment, he nodded his head. It's possible, yeah. Sighing deeply, Gabriella stood up and announced, let's have some fun for the next few hours. Sleep is something for the weak. Hearing this, Greg immediately jumped overjoyed, shouting, yes, let's do that. While Malia rubbed her wet eyes with a faint, Jason and Mark also nodded their head and the 5 of them spent the whole night talking, playing, and having fun until it was time for them to drive towards the arena for the next 2 tournament rounds. It was Thursday and the Big 3 tournament was slowly approaching the final with the top 50 and top 25 rounds being held. Both Jason and Greg were still fit even though they didn't sleep, while Jason's mana was overquilling with energy because he passively gathered mana in addition to his sub-area which did the same. Smiling brightly, he felt full of power and ready to fight against his opponent in the top 50 and afterward Greg, which he already anticipated. In the end, Jason didn't even think about his first opponent because he felt confident in defeating everyone with his current strength except Greg if he were to exclude his fortified soul conjunction. Asterix's young elite was already powerful and it would have been a lie if Jason said that he looked down on them. However, it was still a fact that his current combat prowess was incomparable several months ago, where he was not even able to attend a normal high school. Thinking about this, he smiled lightly as he and the Flays sat down on their seats, waiting for the two youths' turn to fight against their first opponent. Only half an hour after the tournament's top 50 round began, it was Greg's turn, and he entered the arena filled with confidence, staring at his opponent, who had a bulky physique, telling Greg that his opponent might also have a physical soul, as he had. Jason's mana eyes confirmed Greg's thought, which he however didn't know because he already stood in the arena. He doesn't have transmuted but is almost at the 3rd expert rank with his soul's amplification. So his physique should be at the 4th expert rank or even higher. Concluding the facts, Jason couldn't help but smile slightly as he already roughly figured out what exactly his friend wanted to do. As such, he simply waited and anticipated the fight that started in front of him. Without further ado, Greg and his opponent charged at each other with mana circulating in their body. Their velocity was already fast enough to be on par with low-evolved beasts, and Jason was sure that they might even be able to fight against weaker evolved beasts with their body alone, which was not bad at their age. However, while charging at his opponent, Greg's body turned red as his physique inflated, releasing hot steam as he appeared before the shocked bulky youth, that didn't expect the change in his opponent to be so devastating. Not only did his body inflate, but he also released the desire to defeat his opponent on an extremely advanced level, which made it almost comparable to bloodlust. Jason's eyes also widened when he noticed this, and he could only see Greg punching his petrified opponent's abdomen, which caused him to be flung away several dozen meters, where he landed on the ground, crying out in pain. Gulping down his saliva, Jason looked at Greg before he averted his gaze to the youth that laid on the ground with disrupted and chaotic mana fluctuations radiation from him. Maybe this will be even more difficult than I estimated, Jason suddenly thought, estimating his friend's physique to be comparable to an average 7th expert rank when he activated his physique. Blinking several times, he couldn't help but feel astonished because even with his fortified soul conjunction, Jason was sure that his body could only handle a physique at the 6th expert rank, even if Scorpio might be able to increase his strength further. If he wanted to fight his friend head-on with his physique, he would have to go beyond his current limit and injure himself to a certain degree, which was not really what he wanted to do. As such, Jason concluded that not only might he be forced to let one of his soul bonds enter his mana core to increase his strength, but that he would also be forced to reveal all 3 affinities with their most powerful attacks. However, instead of feeling down, hearing that his friend became extremely strong was something Jason felt happy about. Without being able to go all out, he was forced to either hold back and defeat his opponents or flee from stronger opponents if he couldn't defeat them even after using everything he had. As if that was not enough, Greg's eyes looked crystal clear, which meant that he was able to fully control his body instead of his instincts. This fact was one the most important for Jason to conclude that his fight against Greg would be amazing, pushing the two youths' adrenaline to the top. While the medic team rushed towards the youth laying on the ground, writhing in pain, Greg extinguished his berserk ability because he was only able to use it for a bunch of minutes each day, as he sat down next to Jason, as if nothing special happened at all. The two youths were extremely nonchalant right now and didn't even talk about Greg's fight, and one could only feel the dense fighting spirit being released, indicating the desire to fight, which caused Malia, Gabriella, and Mark's eyes to widen slightly. They worried about the two youths' well-being if they were to go all out. However, instead of holding them back, they supported the decision because it was the last fight they would have together, and it would have to be a magnificent fight for the two to be able to separate without feeling bad. Chapter 275 Pity by Hydesgrain. There was not much time between Greg's fight and Jason's, and only 2 matches later, Jason and a feeble-looking girl with thick glasses entered the arena. However, instead of underestimating her, he was sure that she was one of the strongest out of the remaining students because her mana core size already reached the average of a 5th expert rank, even though her mana core was barely at the 2nd expert rank. Jason didn't know her name, but that didn't really matter because he didn't want to waste too much thinking about unnecessary things, as he only glanced at her mana core in order to figure out her affinity and her soul bond's rank. Mid unblemished. Wood or vine affinity, he began to wonder because the transmutation he perceived from the girl was somewhat similar to Lin's, who he went into the 4-star rift with. Jason knew that Lin was probably dead, and lamenting about this youth's choice to shoot at him in order to save himself was also not something he would do, because it was a waste of time in which he could do other more important things. As such, he saw everything rather rational, and comparing the two transmuted mana flows with each other, Jason could tell that the girl had a similar, yet different affinity than Lin. But rather than being scared because she had most likely an unblemished beast as her soulbond, Jason felt a little bit bad about it. This had multiple reasons, and the simplest was that her physique should be at the second expert without receiving a high amplification from her soul world, which was the most common for nature, wood, and other similar affinities. As such, the only small issue should be her affinity, but after thinking for a short moment, he concluded that it was unfortunate for the female student to be matched against him right now. When they stood opposite each other, Jason smiled at her lightly, but the girl in front of him looked extremely serious, which caused him to lift his right eyebrow. With the AI initiating the start of their match, the girl immediately manifested several tight thick vines that grew out of her hands, only to pierce into the ground where they dug themselves through. Seeing this, Jason nodded his head as he manifested several icicles in front of him, which he shot at the girl, who immediately manifested a thick vine wall in front of her. Shattering on the vine wall, the icicles froze a few vines, only to be replaced by another batch of vines. Perceiving what she was doing, Jason's smile widened before he summoned multiple black fireballs around him. Throwing them one after another at the exact same spot, they burned through the vine wall, only to arrive in front of his opponent, where he allowed them to explode. Thinking that it might be over in a short moment, he let his guard down for a quarter of a second when his mana eyes perceived something below him as he instinctively exerted the weightless steps technique to his highest capabilities, only to jump to the side. At the spot he was previously on, several thorny vines pierced out of the ground, only to lash out in every direction until they received new instructions. Without further ado, the vines suddenly stiffened as they pierced into Jason's direction, where he retreated to. Huh. My fireballs didn't work, Jason asked himself before he unsheathed his Viridi Starstream daggers in order to sever the vines that lashed out at him. Even if his opponent's ability was at the unblemished rank, manifesting several tight thick, and several dozen meter-long veins at that rank would waste too much mana, which was also the reason for Jason to be able to cut the veins rather easily. After the vines were finally severed, Jason averted his attention back to the girl, who was suddenly enveloped in a thick red flower bud, which caused him to widen his eyes. Did she just summon her soulbond, or is that an ability? He asked himself, astonished, but after thinking about it for a moment, it couldn't have been a soulbond because the AI didn't say anything about it, which would have been the case otherwise. As such, the girl in front of him used her soulbond's ability, which seemed to counter his fire ability. This ability is extremely useful and suitable with such an affinity, Jason praised inwardly, but his smile didn't leave his lips for a single second. With the weightless steps technique still exerted, Jason charged towards his opponent, as he manifested multiple icicles around him, which he shot all at the vine wall and the flower, enveloping and at the same time protecting the young girl. Smiling brightly, his opponent could almost immediately tell that something was wrong, as she looked at the icicles that shattered without much effort once they came in touch with anything. There was not even the need to protect herself against these icicles, but what came after shocked her extremely as green fog permeated the air where the icicles exploded. Once the poison that permeated the air encountered the vines, they almost immediately began to corrode, with their life force diminishing at a visible pace as they shrunk in size. The female student's eyes widened and she started to supply more mana into her vines, only to see that her mana consumption was higher than the benefits she obtained. Severing her contact with the vines, she summoned new ones with the use of her ability, which used up more mana but made them more resistant to fire and other elemental affinities. However, what she didn't notice was that not only did Jason throw out several dozen poisonous icicles at his opponent and the surrounding but he himself already released a thick green mist, which was one of his newest achievements. His poisonous fog was extremely corrosive with a paralyzing trait added, allowing him to incapacitate opponents without killing them. At most, he would hurt them a lot and injure them by corroding their skin, but instead of killing them, it would only paralyze others, which was exactly what he wanted to achieve for several reasons. Not only was it extremely useful for his current fight, where he was not allowed to kill someone, but also for other things. Jason also wanted to figure out ways to capture beasts with high potential to either tame them before contracting or even to sell them, if he was extremely short on money. It was not like he loved this way to make profits, and it was only something he would do if he could find no other way to earn funds for something he desperately needed without enough time to slowly accumulate the required money by other means. However, other than that, Jason could also change the composition of his poison affinity with Scorpio's help, who always tried to comprehend more about its affinity. In the end, he could only look at his opponent in pity because the female student he was fighting wouldn't have it easy for the next few minutes. This was partially his fault, as it was extremely difficult to control Scorpio's poison affinity with the poison's complex composition, while at the same time releasing his ice affinity with a feeble ice layer around the fog in order to throw poisonous icicles at his opponent, without shattering them before. Almost the whole combat ground was filled with green poisonous fog, and only a thin barrier, the AI erected, prevented it from leaking outside, as the monitoring youths, teachers, and even several honorable citizens who were allowed to watch the fight heard the young girl shrieking out in pain, filling the whole arena with terror. Victory, Jason Stellar. Chapter 276 If He's Here, What About, by Hydesgrain. Victory, Jason Stellar. Immediately after Jason heard this message from the AI, he stopped releasing the poisonous fog, as he enveloped the writhing and crying girl in front of him in a thick layer of ice in order to prevent the more corrosive poison from injuring her skin while at the same time cooling her down. Even if she could be healed later, the pain she had to go through was not something everyone could overcome just like that, and she might even end up with small trauma. He didn't feel anything from his own poison, and even foreign poison should be less effective against him thanks to Scorpio's hard work to comprehend and compose all kinds of poison while he was inside the soul world. Looking at the girl in front of him, Jason felt suddenly extremely bad because he was still unable to perfectly control his poison affinity, and to add on, the poison he released was required to have a high corrosive effect thanks to the vines covering her completely. Sighing deeply, he felt a strong gust of wind around him, as the poisonous fog was dissolved, with him and the ice-layered girl being revealed. The medic team was shocked to see the girl's appearance and glared at Jason, who could only glance at the girl apologetically as he released her out of the small ice layer he manifested around her. Releasing multiple healing currents from their affinity, the medic team ignored Jason's whole existence when they infused her multiple potions with all kinds of colors, after smearing a lotion on her corroded skin. Walking out of the arena, he was glared at by almost all students, teachers, and citizens around him, as even the flays looked at him weirdly. Greg gulped down his saliva, as he asked, "Will you do the same against me?" Hearing this, and noticing Greg's hesitation, Jason couldn't help but smirk as he teased. "So you want to beat me up with your berserk ability, while I can't even release some poison? I didn't know that you were such a feeble youth. Should I go and purchase some baby powder and wipes, so you can release everything without any problems?" Frowning, Greg didn't even know what to say, as he tried to comprehend what exactly Jason meant with baby powder and wipes. Release everything without any problems. Is he comparing me to a baby right now? Making his own conclusion, Greg glared at his friend, as he gritted his teeth, as he said, "I'll take you down, even if you use everything you have." When Greg said these words, Jason smiled, and he also hoped that he could use everything up to his sleeves. After a short while, Jason's defeated opponent was carried out of the arena and the tournament continued as if nothing happened. Almost 2 more hours passed until the top 50 round was completed with the last 25 participants remaining, and a short break in order to recuperate was made before the next round would start. Talking with the flays, Jason suddenly noticed Seren approaching him from far away, with a familiar youth next to him. Seeing the blue-haired youth next to Seren, Jason involuntarily stiffened as his eyes widened in shock. Max Drake. Why is he here? Max Drake's appearance itself was not something he should be afraid of, but what his appearance on Asterix included was obvious. More than a month ago, Max left with the Drake family patriarch to Canir, but with him being in front of him, this could only mean that the Drake family patriarch or someone below him was there. Goosebumps covered his whole body and he could hardly contain himself, as Seren saw him. Waving his trembling hand, as if nothing special happened, Malia noticed his anxiety and a trace of fear in his eyes, which was something she never saw in his eyes, even when Lux shot at him inside the 4-star rift. This caused her to feel immediately uncomfortable, as she also stiffened slightly because it couldn't be something positive. Approaching the Flays and Jason, Seren with Max next to them greeted everyone politely, while Seren was somewhat disappointed in Jason. However, he understood that he couldn't force his friend into doing something he didn't want, and in the end, it wouldn't be a disadvantage for him, even if he was forced to wait a little bit longer. The chance that Jason could help him to pick the better Earth Dragon egg was there, and Seren couldn't just disregard this opportunity. Gripping it firmly was better than doing something wrong. It was also surprising for Seren that Max arrived in front of his house late the previous night, and it was fortunate that he was at home, otherwise, Max would have to stay somewhere else. However, what was even weirder was Till's reaction, because his eyes widened slightly, as he saw Max before he started to ask him weird questions, like, where was his father and, who came with you to Asterix? Not being able to comprehend what exactly Till wanted to figure out, Seren could only ask his master, who decided to not answer for the moment. Taking a few deep breaths, Jason's golden eyes shimmered vibrantly as he began to calm down slowly. Introducing everyone to Max, he seized him up with, and he couldn't help but feel awestruck as he noticed that Max's mana core already entered the 6th expert rank, while his soul world amplified his mana core size to the 9th expert rank. Jason was already aware that Max's formed a soulbond contract with an unblemished beast, but he was still astonished to see that his mana core size increased by such a large margin. His mana was also transmuted to a high degree, which indicated a high water affinity, which caused Jason to estimate that Max's soulbond was a beast that solely focused on its water affinity, which innately possesses a high amount of mana. Even if Jason couldn't be sure of that fact, he just hoped so, because otherwise, Max's soul world would amplify his physique and mana core to the same degree as Jason's. Shaking his head, he looked at Max, who returned his gaze with a faint smile, as he said, "Hello, Jason." Hearing this, Jason couldn't help but feel taken aback for a moment, because the blue-haired youth in front of him seemed to be completely changed from his prior arrogant behavior, and Max noticed this, as he said, "After the arrival of the 3 envoys, many things changed, just don't ask about it, alright?" Somehow, Max's seemed pitiful to Jason right now, because there was a distinct pain in his eyes, which caused him to think about the possible reason for this. What could have changed his demeanor to such a degree and at the same time inflict so much pain, that it's still apparent in his eyes? However, even after pondering about it for some time, Jason could only imagine that it had something to do with the 3 envoys, which Max already said, and probably his behavior at this time, which was rather anxious. Maybe his father forced him to do something, to become less anxious if something like this were about to happen again. But without any evidence, it wouldn't be right to conclude anything, as such he decided to focus on the more important things. Still looking at Max, Jason straightforwardly asked, "Your father should be busy, right? How did you come here? It should be pretty far to come here just like that without any reason, right?" Max's lips twitched for a second before he answered, "My grandpa wanted to see me and my father told me to take his subordinates with. Now that I think about it, Grandpa wanted to talk to you after he received a message from my father. But you were right, he is pretty busy and couldn't come here." After he finished his speech, Max still added an extremely silent, "fortunately," before he looked at Jason for a moment. Hearing that old Drake wanted to see him, Jason could hardly contain his facial expression, but rather than feeling down, he felt good because the Drake family patriarch was not present, and instead his subordinates. Even if they were sovereigns, Jason doubted that they were stronger than Shane, when he suddenly thought about his master's injury, which decreased his combat prowess by a large margin. Chapter 277 Threatened by Hydesgrain. Trying to find an excuse to reject old Drake's invitation, Jason couldn't help but sigh as he knew that it was impossible without looking suspicious. Nodding his head, he asked Max where exactly old Drake was before he stood up from his seat. Separating from the Flays to talk to old Drake, Max decided to lead him, with Seren accompanying the two youths. Jason looked calm on the outside, but his inside was chaotic, with thousands of thoughts tormenting him. Will Shane be there if I need him? Should I call him once I'm alone? What is this bullshit? Can't I have my peace please? Cursing inside his mind for some time, they already arrived in front of a large high-graded wooden door that released dense mana currents. However, this couldn't distract Jason's firm gaze, which already perceived one almost broken mana core, Till's familiar mana fluctuations at the Lord rank, and two sovereign ranked mana cores with a single somewhat crude-shaped prismarine crystal which was somewhat calming, even if his heart skipped a beat. Two lords would have been even better, Jason couldn't help but think for a second, but it was only obvious that not everything could go according to his desire. As such, the three youths entered the room where Max walked towards old Drake while Seren halted his steps next to Till. To Jason, it felt as if they wanted to interrogate him or maybe even worse. However, Till's faint smile assured him to a certain degree as he tried to calm down. Clearing his throat, Jason straightforwardly asked, without trying to waste any time. Old Drake, is there a specific reason for me to come here? I think I'm interrupting something. Glancing at the two sovereign ranks that stood nearby old Drake, Jason couldn't help but feel uncomfortable under their stares that seemed to threaten him. Gulping down his saliva, he averted his attention back to old Drake, who answered him calmly, "That's not the problem, Jason. Rather than that, we talked about you. I watched your fights and asked the Patriarch to come over and see your magnificent combat prowess. Unfortunately, he couldn't come because there seems to be a small issue he has to solve. However, instead he was generous enough to send over his subordinates, which are able to determine your strength." When old Drake finished talking, Jason felt that his bad premonition came true, as his fear intensified, as he asked to be sure. "And what exactly does that have to do with me being called here?" He was already aware of the answer, but Jason had to be sure, even if he didn't want to hear the obvious answer. Old Drake started to smile at Jason innocently, as he said, "I think you already know what the Drake family patriarch wants. In order to defend ourselves against the foreign races, we need to strengthen our clan strength, and what would be better than nurturing prodigies? Obviously, the Drake family patriarch won't nurture anybody, and also not without being assured about their loyalty. The outcome is obvious, right? If you want to receive the Drake family's resources, you need to sign a soul contract with the Drake family patriarch or someone he trusts." Sighing deeply, Jason couldn't help but shudder as his premonition came true, as he looked at old Drake, asked sarcastically, "What if I don't want to receive the glorious change to receive the Drake family's resources?" He was extremely pissed at old Drake, who looked at him as if everything he did was for Jason's own good without feeling remotely bad about what he was doing right now. Hypocrite, Jason cursed inwardly, as one of the sovereigns next to old Drake suddenly exploded. A peasant like you without any background should feel thankful to be even able to talk to the Drake family, and after showing this puny combat prowess which barely meets the requirements, you want to decline such an opportunity. Are you fucking kidding me? Releasing some of his mana with killing intent to envelop Jason, his eyes turned cold as he added, "If you don't accept the offer the Drake family gives you, you might as well be our enemy, and I think it's obvious what happens if we capture an enemy. You'll die." Intensifying the killing intent, Jason could barely breathe, and there was nothing he could do as old Drake lifted his finger, telling the sovereign rank to calm down. Jason was released from the killing intent that almost killed him, as he slumped to the ground, barely being able to breathe, as Till appeared next to Jason to look if he was fine, with healing currents enveloping him. These bastards. Till was surprised to hear what old Drake said, and it was as if he changed completely and old Drake's gentle expression turned cold. Old Drake was known as gentle and kind, but he would only behave like this if he could gain something from such behavior. Max, who stood next to his grandfather a moment ago, retreated several steps when he realized what was going on. Not believing it, he looked around the room, only to see Seren's shocked expression, which also seemed to say, "What is going on here?" Both youths didn't know what happened, and it felt as if they were thrown out of their own playground into the cruel reality within seconds. They neither imagined that the Drake family would force prodigious youths into a soul contract, nor that they were so overbearing, threatening Jason with his death. Max averted his gaze from Jason to the two Drake family subordinates that came with him. While the one that almost killed Jason was still enraged, Max could see deep pain and pity glimmering in the other middle-aged man's eyes, telling him that Jason was not the first one to be forced into submission. Yet, he was still unable to believe that this happened in front of him. Taking deep breaths, he tried to calm down, as he saw Jason standing up with his golden eyes turned extremely cold without any trace of warmth and kindness left. Looking at old Drake, Jason couldn't help but hold back anymore, as he said, "Is that the only reason I was asked to come here, or is there even something important you wanted to say?" Hearing this, old Drake smiled, as the Sovereign Rank was about to release his killing intent once again in order to kill Jason cruelly after tormenting him for a while, only to be held back by old Drake. Smiling brightly, old Drake looked more like a devil than a human to Jason, as he said, "Young boy, you're really interesting due to multiple reasons, and you know that, or am I wrong? Your soul awakening rating is a bad joke, otherwise, how would you be able to contract 3 mid to peak evolved ranked beasts at your age? However, other than that, your eyes and combat prowess are what I'm really interested in, while your personality is pleasing to my eyes, ha ha ha. If I could, I would just force you into submission right now without wasting a single second. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed, and neither is now the perfect timing." Frowning, Jason was unsure what exactly old Drake meant, as Till stood up next to him, looking serious at old Drake as he said, "If you were to force Jason into submission right now or even kill him, it would create bad blood between the Drake family with the Grail and Jiwaya family because we still need him." Old Drake, who was astonished about this revelation, and lifted his eyebrow as he said in a cold, yet overbearing voice, "Why exactly do you need Jason? This has nothing to do with the Grail and Jiwaya family. Don't involve yourself in our family's business only because of a single youth. I don't think you can take the responsibility to start a war, or am I wrong?" Next to old Drake, the enraged Sovereign Rank once again released his mana fluctuations to underline the spoken words. However, instead of being forced to retreat, Till's eyes turned cold, as he said, "You are butting into our business if you force Jason into submission right now, and I give a sh*t whether I have the responsibility to wage a war or not, but I don't think you should mess with the direct heir of the Jiwaya family and me, the Grail's patriarch's second son. Once we finish our business, you can do whatever you want. We already have an agreement with the Drake family patriarch about our business, and I don't think you are eligible to take the responsibility to start a war against us only because you're impatient." Jason's heart felt warm when he heard Till's words, even if he might be after his own benefits, but this didn't matter for the moment as he could breathe more freely without the fear of being forced into submission or killed right now. When Till finished his words, the Sovereign Rank next to old Drake almost immediately retraced his killing intent, as old Drake sighed deeply, mumbling, "Jail never said that he should be forced into submission immediately, right? What else did he say?" As if he remembered something, old Drake averted his gaze back to Jason, as their eyes met. "The Drake family patriarch told me to offer you a better soul contract if you win against the strongest youth on Asterix. That should be Greg Flay, whom you're fighting soon." Hearing this, Jason frowned deeply, as old Drake added, smiling craftily, "Because I like your attitude and strength, I might even be able to offer you a better contract than that. That is under the condition that you defeat Greg Flay in the top 25 and your next opponent in the top 13 tomorrow. Huh, Jason thought, and he couldn't really understand old Drake's reasoning for this. What is so special about the top 13 and why does he even bother to give me the possibility to receive a better contract? It's not like I can do anything against it either way, except dying. Seeing Jason's suspicious face, old Drake's hideous smile widened, as he said while laughing cruelly, your opponent in the top 13 will be Max. Isn't that interesting? Chapter 278 Despair by Hydesgrain. Your opponent in the top 13 will be Max. Isn't that interesting? Hearing this, Jason's frown deepened as he averted his gaze towards Max, whose expression was filled with shock, which caused him to wonder how the blue-haired youth even survived on Canir until now. Does he even know anything about his clan or family? Jason asked inwardly to himself. If he were, to be honest, a soul contract was nothing bad per se, because it could also be a simple contract, preventing Party B to become hostile to Party A. A soul contract could also state that the contracted person was not allowed to have contact with certain other clans or foreign races. In the end, a soul contract was not something Jason was afraid of, but the clauses stated within because they might be devastating and extremely restricting, like Till already told him. Jason concluded that the big families handled their soul contracts differently, while it was highly likely that one clause would be to stay loyal to Party A's big clan or something similar to that. Another thing, Jason imagined, was that foreign races were unable to form a soul contract with such individuals that pledged loyalty to the big families, which caused these races to disregard these humans' whole existence. This thought was extremely important, and thinking about it, Jason found that it was most likely the only reason for foreign races to ignore the big families without trying to lure them over. Instead of that, they would more likely try to convince them to work together by giving them presents to earn their trust before they would be able to do anything else. In the end, he also began to wonder how many big clans were backed by foreign races and if that was also the reason for the war between the different countries. Did the foreign races intervene in our business, trying to build a monarchy from a single big clan in order to nurture more prodigious youths for themselves? With this thought, Jason also concluded that everything could turn extremely nasty and chaotic once a single big clan attained a big advantage over the others' clans, because the different foreign races wouldn't just let this slide without doing anything against it. Sighing deeply, he shook his head as he continued to stare at Max, only to see that his expression worsened, filled with shock and even despair, which confused Jason. Seeing this and also Seren's expression, he felt that it was weird that both youths were so naive, when he finally remembered that the three of them were only 14 to 15 years old, and he could only sigh deeply. Having a joyous childhood was never something I expected to receive, but isn't that too much right now? Feeling that the odds were against him, Jason's mood soured, and he was only glad that Till stood by his side, helping him to a certain extent, without waging war against the Drake family. Old Drake in front of him seemed to have finished his speech, and he seemed extremely confident, which was either because he thought that Jason, Shane, and Dahlia didn't have any contact with each other, or that Shane's injury restricted his combat prowess so that the two sovereigns next to him would be strong enough to take care of him. There were also other possibilities, but without the Drake family patriarch here, old Drake seemed to be just too confident, which was definitely weird. Other than that, his sudden change in attitude frustrated Jason, because he initially thought that old Drake was someone kind, he could trust. Apparently, that was not the case, and when old Drake told him that he could go to fight against Greg, Jason simply turned around. Walking towards the large door, goosebumps covered his whole body as cold sweat ran down his back when he felt old Drake's creepy stare on him. Gulping down his saliva, he opened the door in order to leave the room. It was not long after he left the room that Jason suddenly began to exert his weightless steps technique to rush towards the bathroom that was close to the arena to prevent attracting too much attention. If old Drake or one of the sovereigns were to monitor him, it might look like he was anxious or even in despair, which might even cause him to vomit. Jason didn't have to vomit, but he felt anxious and uncomfortable as he called his masters through the messenger crystals, disregarding the possibility of someone else entering its frequency. The runes on the crystal brightened up and Jason waited anxiously for his masters to accept his call, and to hear their reassuring voices. However, seconds passed. Half a minute elapsed. Even after 2 minutes, there was no answer, as the manifested rune diminished. The messenger crystal began to crumble and was barely held together by the runes on it. With this, Jason knew that he had only one call left as he bit his lips with a seed of fear planting inside his heart. Making the last call on the messenger crystal, Jason bit his lips so hard that they began to bleed and he could only look at the crystal that turned into tiny pebbles after 2 minutes passed without anyone answering him. The mana fluctuations released by the messenger crystal were extremely faint and not something to anyone should notice, but Jason felt like he was about to go insane because there was nobody he could rely on as a sudden thought filled his mind. Nobody will save me. Will I end up as a slave? With this thought filling his mind, Jason didn't know what to do anymore when he heard Greg talking to someone outside and he seemed extremely confused. Hello sir. What is that? I don't want to buy anything, sorry. I'm only searching for my friend, Ha. He is on the toilet. How do you know that? I should give him that. Who are you? Wait. Hearing his friend's voice, Jason forced himself to calm down as he took a few deep breaths. Even if it was only partially helpful, he didn't want his friend to see him like this right now. Right now, Jason looked like he was about to go insane with his bloodshot golden eyes and blood running down his lips. Looking to his right side, he suddenly jumped up when he perceived Greg's familiar mana core with the particular fluctuations. However, more important to Jason, who crashed open the door as he charged out of the bathroom, was the overly familiar mana fluctuations he noticed from the person Greg talked to. Shane. Running into Greg, Jason was about to rush after Shane only for Greg to obstruct his path, and before he could push his friend away, Shane's concealed mana core disappeared inside a crowd of students, teachers, and citizens whose mana fluctuations overlapped, preventing Jason from seeing anything beyond clearly. Even if he couldn't see Shane, Jason was still relieved with his whole accumulated frustration, anxiety, and fear dissipating within a single moment, as Greg shook his body violently. Jason. What is wrong with you? We have to fight now. You are almost too late. Are you okay? Trying to figure out what was going on with his friend, Greg only saw the big contrast between his lips where blood still dripped from and his bloodshot eyes that gleamed brightly as if he was overjoyed, which looked weird in contrast. Jason, who remembered that Greg was next to him, noticed a paper in his hand as he immediately asked obtrusive about it. I heard you talking to someone outside the bathroom. Is that piece of paper for me? Blinking several times, Greg shook his head, before he handed over the paper, as he said, yeah, there was an old man that handed me this paper, saying that it was for you. He also said that I can find you inside the bathroom. Weird, right? Smiling lightly, Jason immediately opened the piece of paper only to see 2 simple sentences written on it. I'll take care of everything. Don't dare to slack off. Chapter 279 All Out by Hydesgrain. Smiling at the message, Jason had to suppress his emotions, otherwise, he might as well cry in front of Greg, which wouldn't be pleasing for both of them. As such, he closed the piece of paper again, before he stored it away in his storage device. Looking at Greg, a radiant smile emerged on his face as he said, "Are you ready to fight me?" After he released his whole tension, Jason couldn't suppress his joy anymore because he would neither have to die if he were to reject the Drake family's offer nor accept it, being forced into submission. If that was not something to be happy about, there was still the fact that Shane was already here and that he was about to fight against Greg. Before that, he was still anxious if he could go all out, but now it was a completely different matter because Shane was there. Furthermore, fighting against Greg with all his might after he became stronger was something he wanted to do. Even more so after Greg's soul bond evolved and him being able to control the inherited berserk ability. Hearing Jason's words, Greg couldn't help but also smile at him as both of them turned in the direction of the arena, which they approached with slow, yet steady steps. Looking back one more time, Jason was unable to find Shane, but that didn't matter anymore as they finally entered the arena that seemed to be more crowded than it initially was. There were several thousand students with their teachers like before, but now the number of citizens watching the matches increased by a large margin, which caused Jason to smile lightly as he thought that their top 25 from the first-year students would most likely become the most exciting match to look at for the whole tournament. Greg was also in awe, seeing that so many people would look at his fight, but rather than feeling insecure, there was a confident smile on his face. It was almost too late for them to enter the arena, and a few citizens already started to complain when everyone saw the two youths laughing with each other as they entered the arena. Seeing this, there was one simple thought in everyone's mind, souring their mood and dimming their expectations when one citizen spoke out what everyone was thinking about. These two youths are obviously good friends. Can they even fight properly against each other? They'll most likely hold back if it looks too dangerous. How disappointing. This citizen's voice was so loud that even Greg and Jason were able to hear it, which caused them to halt their steps, only to stare at the citizen in front of them as Jason mumbled. This is not something an old man with a mana core rank at the master rank should say. Just focus on yourself and don't bother other people. Just look and see. Rolling his eyes, Jason entered the arena, not bothering that he was looked at with widened eyes, and the man who said everyone's thought out loud, slumped back on his seat, dumbfounded. Gritting his teeth, he couldn't say anything against this youth's undeniable truth because everyone started to look at him amused. He was incapable to compress his mana into a liquefied drop of mana even at his age, which was embarrassing. Comparing himself to young prodigies was as if one compared trash with a raw diamond. Forcing himself to not jump up, curse, and charge at the youth, the man was sure that the security would beat him into a pulp if he were to be noticed in a bad way one more time. Gulping down his saliva, he remained silent, while enduring the amused gazes on him, that seemed to laugh at him. Jason didn't mind this disruption, as he stood inside the combat arena, waiting for Greg, who also regained his senses. Standing opposite each other at a distance of roughly 40 meters, the two youths smiled as they released their fighting spirit. Their demeanor changed almost immediately, and from the viewer's perspective, it looked like both youths neither knew each other nor laughed together only a moment ago, and they were solely focused on their fight, which the AI started. Without wasting any time, Jason already ordered Scorpio to enter his mana core, creating a faint dark green-bluish layer around his mana core, enlarging it, while his physique was strengthened. Right now, his body could barely handle the sudden amplification from the fortified soul conjunction to the 6th expert rank in both mana core size and physical strength. However, that was already enough for Greg to notice a major change in Jason's demeanor and mana fluctuations that seemed to ravage vigorously inside his body. Gulping down his saliva, he also activated his berserk ability, after the AI initiated the start of their fight. Jason's mana fluctuations ravaged through his body, yet his outer appearance didn't change, while Greg's body enlarged with his skin turning red as his eyes turned bloodshot. The sudden change in both youths only a quarter of a second after their match started, shocked everyone, when both exerted their movement technique to their highest capabilities, only to take out their weapons while charging at each other. Aware that his physical strength was lower than Greg's and that he had a slight disadvantage with his weapon choice, Jason couldn't help but feel ecstatic when he felt the mana ravaging in his body. He never really fought against someone with the fortified soul conjunction fully utilized, and it was the first time for him to feel so much mana inside him if one were to disregard the mana sphere bracelet, which he could only use for external means. It was not something he could feel within himself, and with this thought, his daggers appeared inside his hands with several dozen blazing icicles manifesting around him. Shooting all of them towards Greg, who used his brute force to shatter the icicle with black flames flickering inside, he got to feel what it meant to disregard Jason's black origin flame. Once the icicles shattered, the black flames erupted with searing heat, burning Greg's hair and skin below when he already emerged in front of Jason to greet him with an onslaught of fast punches. Jason's physique was lower than Greg's, but he could use 3 affinities, which should normally be enough to completely overwhelm his opponent. However, Greg was different, because he already knew how strong Jason's elemental attacks were, with the sole exception of the poison affinity. Evading the first few punches, Greg forced him to retreat, as Jason gritted his teeth to summon multiple icicles and fireballs, which he shot towards his friend without regarding if he would sustain heavy injuries or not. Crying out in pain, Greg suddenly lifted Jason into the air, completely ignoring the cuts he sustained from Jason's daggers when he threw him through the arena. Being thrown through the air, Jason couldn't help but smile because his excitement overwhelmed him, only to crash into the ground. Coughing up some blood, he forced himself to stand up without wasting any time. Barely wiping away the blood before staring at Greg, who seemed to be in a worse situation than he was. His enlarged body had multiple light cuts and holes in it which he sustained through Jason's dagger thrusts and icicles, while his burned skin looked even worse. Meanwhile, Jason sustained more internal injuries through the impact in Greg's punches, which shook his whole body and internal organs. If he didn't know better, Jason would be sure that he had some broken ribs. Nevertheless, the two youths smiled at each other excitedly, as if they were playing around, which caused everyone around to look at the youths in shock. Who the hell said that these two were good friends? Aren't they arch enemies in their final battle to decide who can survive and who will have to die? Everyone thought, and the man who complained out loud turned even quieter than before, if that was even possible, as his eyes equally widened. What are these youths? Monsters. However, neither of the two couldn't help themselves because they didn't even realize their own injuries. After he was thrown through the air, Jason lost grip around his daggers and they were too far away for him to reach right now when Greg started to exert his movement technique once again. Ignoring that he didn't have a weapon left, he exerted his weightless steps technique to the limit, only to notice that he could still inject more of his mana into it, which he did without hesitation. His mana consumption increased by a large margin, and Jason knew that he wouldn't be able to supply the weightless steps technique that seemed to have advanced to the perfect mastery for longer than 2 minutes at most, even after his mana core size enlarged to the 6th expert rank. Nevertheless, 2 minutes would be more than enough because he doubted that Greg could sustain his berserk ability for much longer. As such, he used everything up to his sleeves to charge at Greg with his perfect mastery of the weightless steps technique fully utilized. Jason's speed increased by another 15%, increasing his velocity by a total of 60%, only to emerge below Greg, who was now slower by a small margin than he was. Dealing out several punches, Jason evaded every single one of Greg's punches as Greg suddenly kicked at Jason's body, which was leaned forward. Seeing this, he twisted his body into an uncomfortable angle to barely avoid the attack. At the same time, he manifested a compressed ice shard, shaped into a sharp blade, which he pierced into Greg's back of the knee with all his might. Crying out in pain, Greg's leg gave in as Jason noticed something with shock, which caused his eyes to quiver slightly. Not only turned his friend's eyes crimson red without a single trace of white left, but his whole remaining mana was instantly used up, enlarging Greg's body, when he turned his steaming, red head towards Jason. Damn. Chapter 280 Silence by Hydesgrain. Seeing how Greg's whole demeanor changed into that of a ferocious beast, Jason frowned as he pushed himself away with all his might, only to notice that his leg was firmly grasped by Greg. He was lifted high in the air and couldn't help but think that his friend lost all his reasoning when he saw his eyes, which led Jason to disregard the possibility of injuring his Greg when he pierced out with the ice dagger towards his friend's arm without holding back. Normally this would have been enough to pierce through Greg's skin into his flesh, only to be forcefully halted at his bones. However, now Jason's ice blade shatters when he barely grazed Greg's skin. His eyes widened involuntarily, with a shocking thought revering through his mind. Did his physique increase to the master rank? This should have been impossible, even if Greg's berserk ability was extremely powerful, increasing his strength by over a dozen levels was not something a normal body could take. And after seeing that Greg's skin burst open with blood pouring out, Jason understood that his friend released his whole mana and everything inside him at once in order to fight for a few more seconds, even if he lost all reasoning. Trying to find a way out of Greg's firm grasp, Jason knew that he either had to survive the next few seconds by defending against his powerful punches or that he would have to counterattack. Taking a deep breath, he involuntarily shivered as Greg's punch approached him with a terrifying might and velocity. Sensing the strength behind his friend's punch, he ordered Scorpio to completely release its amplification by fully opening the golden gate between his soul world and mana core. Just like that, Jason's strength increased once again, reaching the combat prowess of an average 8th expert rank in both physical strength and mana core size. Additionally, he manifested Scorpio's exoskeleton around him with the 2-meter-long stinger growing out of his coccyx. Greg still lifted him into the air with his leg in his hand only to swing down his arm, bashing Jason into the ground before Greg punched into his abdomen, which created cracks in the combat arena below Jason. With his sight blurring, Jason was barely able to stay conscious, and he forced himself to use all his remaining mana in addition to Scorpio's to compress his poison affinity inside the stinger behind him, which snapped out, piercing into Greg's burst open skin. Jason felt as if he was about to faint any moment if the pain in his abdomen wouldn't lessen, when he noticed Greg's crimson-red eyes, revealing his brown eyes before he collapsed. Victory, Jason Stellar. Hearing this, Jason was about to faint, and only the thought that entering an unconscious state might be extremely disadvantageous, with old Drake and Sauron around, forced him to stay conscious even if it was extremely uncomfortable. Several seconds passed until he was able to lift himself from the ground. Being able to barely balance himself as he loosened up the stinger that was still pierced inside Greg's wound. Taking out multiple potions at once, Jason gulped them down without hesitation, and feeling the pain substituting by a small margin, he was finally able to breathe more freely again. Looking down at him, he noticed a gaping hole in his azure blue exoskeleton armor, which caused him to gulp. Would I be dead without Scorpio's exoskeleton? He asked himself, shocked, before realizing that Greg was truly unable to get a hold of himself after his berserk ability seemed to have gone out of control by using up everything within his friend. Thinking about his friend, he immediately looked out for Greg, who laid on the ground, almost as if he was dead, and Jason would have been extremely shocked if he didn't have his mana eyes that told him that Greg just overexerted almost everything inside his body, which forced him into the state he was currently in. Turning him around, he took out another batch of potions which Jason forcefully inserted in Greg's mouth when the medic team arrived next to him. Shocked about Greg's situation, they immediately released their healing abilities and particular affinities to soothe his pain. Yet, they couldn't help themselves to eye Jason weirdly. Noticing this, he couldn't help but smile lightly, and once he figured out that Scorpio's exoskeleton and stinger were still manifested, Jason retraced them once again. Looking around, he noticed that the whole arena was eerie silent, without a single noise disrupting the silence, and he could see various emotions in their eyes, like shock, jealousy, and fear. The citizens that were shocked thought that Jason was a foreign race, while the others that were shocked and jealous, most likely knew what Jason's appearance indicated. He was able to manifest his soulbond's exoskeleton and stinger. However, even if nobody could immediately digest that he had a fortified soul conjunction with his soulbond at such a young age, both youths that fought in front of them less than a minute ago showed a ridiculous high combat prowess, considering that both of them had yet to reach the expert rank. From common knowledge, everyone knew that it was easier to break through multiple levels at the lower mana core ranks with the help of soulbonds, and most citizens were not even astonished to see a student being able to defeat someone with a higher mana core rank. However, the previous fights were a joke compared to the one that happened right in front of them. Jason knew that it was not the smarted move from him to reveal his fortified soul conjunction with Scorpio, yet he felt that it was necessary in order to survive against Greg, who couldn't control himself anymore. As such, it was not something he could avoid, and it was already enough for him to know that Shane was here, otherwise, he would have a huge problem by now. Looking towards the direction where the office he was previously in was, Jason could perceive both Sovereign's mana fluctuations flickering violently as if they were excited while old Drake's mana core was about to break, which Jason hoped to happen deep within him. Shaking his head, he would be unable to change anything for now, and it was only fortunate that the two Sovereigns or Drake wouldn't force him into signing a soul contract immediately, which would have been quite bad. In the end, it was a good decision that he offered Seren his help in figuring out which Earth Dragon egg had the highest potential. This gave him, or rather Shane, more time to get him out of the Drake family's clutches, because he wouldn't be able to do that alone, and he would have to ask for help either way. Maybe the only thing he could have done alone would be concealing his mana core, while trying to run as far as possible before entering the closest restricted rift, preventing anyone too powerful from pursuing him. However, there were too many flaws in this plan, and in the end, Jason found that it was only something he could rely on if he were to be completely alone without anyone to rely on, which was not the case. This was his fortune, and Jason told himself that he had to repay Till and his two masters for this, even if it might take a while. After picking up his two daggers, he followed the medic team that carried Greg out of the arena inside the infirmary. Like Malia, Gabriella and Mark appeared next to him. The three were also extremely shocked about the two youths' match against each other, because it was simple as if two strangers were fighting a life and death battle, which created a slight tension between Jason and the three. Nevertheless, after seeing that Jason was extremely worried, this tension almost immediately disappeared, and the Flays told themselves that the two youths just wanted to fight without holding back, even if it ended brutally. Inside the infirmary, Greg was quickly examined and healed by multiple healing abilities and potions. Seeing blood rushing through his ashen pale face, caused everyone to sigh in relief as it turned rosier. He was still unconscious, but his breathing turned more regular, and Jason smiled lightly, when he suddenly heard Till's voice behind him, as the infirmary's door opened. "Jason, I don't want to bother you and the Flays, but we should talk."